Our second text this morning comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verses 1 through 8 and 10 through 12. Listen once more for the word of God. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plains, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his service and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have been thinking recently about fairy tales. We don't watch many Disney movies in our household anymore, but every once in a while, particularly in these long, hot days of summer, Frozen flashes across the screen, and where one Disney movie is, another swiftly follows, like a sort of joy-filled singing virus that takes over its host for a week or two. So we'll go from Elsa to Ursula, from The Little Mermaid to Robin Williams' brilliant Genie, and then back for a second round of Frozen to close the loop. I suspect some of you know this trajectory. Of course, most Disney movies follow a similar narrative. Things are going really well, we really love the protagonists until they're not. And then at the darkest point in the film, when Jafar gets the lamp, when Scar lunges at Simba, just then there is some salvation. The characters that we love, the ones we fear are close to death, mount some incredible victory. Boy gets the girl, and the girl gets her legs and her voice. The sisters unite in a thawed world, and all is happily ever after. The message is clear, if not explicit. For good people, people like us, right? Good people, things will work out. Brief hiccups always lead to triumphant resolution. As a child, I took in Disney's rich narratives and comforting hues with a sort of saccharine expectation for my own happily ever after. The kind where a little girl becomes a princess, some sneezing dwarfs handle all the domestic chores, and some rugs really do fly. You can imagine my surprise then when at an English seminar at PC, I discovered Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm. Their fairy tales, many of which inspired Disney's, were familiar, but they each had these decidedly darker twists. In Andersen's Little Mermaid, almost nothing goes well from the start, and then it all goes wildly wrong in the end. The Arabian Nights stories were about as far from Robin Williams as Clinton is from Baghdad, and even the Grimm brothers, well, they just seemed exactly that, grim. Where stories had resolution, it gnawed in its unfairness. More often than not, though, there was no resolution at all. Like I said, I've been thinking this summer about fairy tales. At the same time, because we are in the middle of a sermon series exploring the many ways that God calls us, I've also been wondering, what I could say this morning about our shared vocation, something each of us is called to. The one thing that we are told will happen in our wild, precious lives. That's when I started to think about Moses. Not the burning bush, as you might expect, not the flight from Egypt, not the hijinks in and throughout Moab. What draws my attention is Mount Nebo, an old prophet surveying the promised land. What draws my attention is endings. Over here in Greenville in the 21st century, we may not know about burning bushes or seas standing on their side. We may not have the power to shout down kings or summon plagues. But we know about endings. Moses' story begins with Abram, with that first passage that Jade read for us this morning. After God creates the world and goes through just a little revision or two, God settles on some this or that elderly fellow and decides that through this otherwise unremarkable man, the world will receive divine presence. God binds himself to Abraham, and Abraham is given a promise. From his hitherto non-existent progeny will come blessing for the whole world, and land. And indeed, Abraham does have a son, two actually, and by those sons, the blessing begins to unfold. But the land remains elusive. 6 generations rise and fall, and the promised land remains just that, a promise, until Moses. Torah, which is the first 5 books of our scripture, the 5 most sacred books of Jewish scripture. Torah is the story of the land and the liberator. It is Moses' story. Moses, who was sent down the river before ending up in Pharaoh's household. Moses going toe-to-toe with Egyptian slave masters and with Pharaoh himself. Moses working wonders until the Hebrew people are freed. Moses in the wilderness going up the mountain to speak with God face to face and returning with commandments and law. Moses who anoints leaders and settles quarrels. Moses who leads the people despite their rebellion, who wanders with them for 40 years, who brings water from the rock and witnesses manna fall from heaven. Moses on the edge of the promised land. Everything in Moses' life anticipates the acquisition of the land. When we come to the end of Torah, to the final chapters of Deuteronomy, only one thing remains, and we should expect it. Moses will enter the land. In our text today, Moses stands on the cusp of inevitability. He looks across the vast horizon of the promise. He surveys his life's work. He is close enough that he could reach it in a day, and just then, it all comes to an end. The text I read today is the closing chapter of Torah. What began with Abraham ends not in the promised land, but in an unmarked grave. Moses, like all people, is buried deep in the earth. Torah ends in anticlimax. Moses' story is unresolved. The great leader dies. Grief settles among the Israelites, coming as it does, as you all know well, in waves, unending sort of waves. The people, like us, they too longed for their leader. They longed for inevitabilities, for predictable happily ever afters. They longed to see Moses enter the land and lead them to it. But there is no Disney ending for this prince of Egypt. The collection of writings that we know as Deuteronomy was codified generations after Moses' death. Not only had the land been conquered by that time, the Israelite kingdom had been built and then fallen. And what was left of the kingdom somewhere in southern Judah, royal scribes diligently put to paper some of the stories of Israel's beginnings. The law, the wanderings, and the great man, Moses. But even those generations later, the grim ending was unsettling for the scribes. Within Deuteronomy, there is no clear consensus, no easy reason offered for Moses' exclusion from the land. In one place, it is recorded that Moses' own folly led to his exile. Maybe so, but then another scribe later blames the Israelites, and both possibilities are repeated. Whatever it was final. Moses' story ends on the cusp of promise. The man whose life began in the low plains of the Nile is buried by his God on a high mountain, overlooking the land he worked for, prayed for, and fought for, but never entered. An ending, right there in the middle, and a haunting fear that if even Moses missed his happily ever after, we could too. My grandmother over in Due West was a personality. In my memory, she is always in this one chair that had clear sight lines to the television and to the front door. And the moment she walked in, I think y'all know grandmas like these, the moment you walked in, she would pull you in and demand a little bit of sugar. Her house was this modest ranch in the midst of my late grandfather's sprawling farm, and it was our family's, my mother's side, it was their hub. My mother and her sisters flitted about while the cousins got up to mischief on the farm or in the treasure-filled basement. There was once an alligator who lived in that basement. And when she died, I was living in New Jersey. After having a stroke, she was airlifted here to Greenville Memorial. But as it turns out, she would, as her children suspected, rather die than attend her own 90th birthday party. Now, and I promise this is going somewhere, it really is. As it happens, around this time, Game of Thrones had just debuted on HBO to critical fanfare. I couldn't afford HBO, but I conned my way into a group that gathered weekly to watch the show and debate its merits. This is before streaming. So here I was, a 25-year-old working at the local Presbyterian church, debating mythology with a priest, a biblical scholar, the chair of the Princeton University Department of Philosophy, and a renowned professor of semiotics. I was in over my head, but I loved it. The company, the show, the dreamy world in which I sat among brilliant folks and discussed the relative merits of a made-up dynasty. The flight to Charlotte to attend my grandmother's funeral was a long one. I had this feeling, this searing feeling that a chapter in my life and our lives was ending, maybe even an entire volume. The grief was heavy. Its burden carried by my mother and her siblings, but passed among the grandchildren too. Something foundational in our lives was ending. And though she lived a good, long life, it still seemed far too soon. Add to that a unique personal problem. I am a terrible, terrible, terrible flyer. I am not good at airplanes. So, when the flight began to climb suddenly in the midst of our descent, I could see the runway, I could see Carowinds, it was all right there, and all of a sudden we were going up. I felt certain that we were in mortal peril. Perhaps you think in those moments I, of all people, would turn to prayer or comfort my agitated neighbor. Perhaps I could say a word of peace, perhaps. Here's what I did instead. I looked at my neighbor square in the face, and this is what I said. I cannot believe I am going to die before I see the ending of Game of Thrones. I'm a little ashamed to admit that. My family is here today. En route to my grandmother's funeral, preparing to see my aunts, my cousins, my whole family, to say goodbye to this home and this community that I loved. And all I can think is how unfair it is, how fundamentally unfair that my life might end in the middle of the story. All I can think of is these unresolved endings. The stupefying fact that no matter how good we are, how hard we work, how much we acquire, endings are the one thing to which each of us across time and place and history is called. Disney did not prepare us for this. We may long for neat resolution, but the fact is that many of the endings we know intimately belong squarely to the Brothers Grimm. Moses was called to a life of service, and he was faithful to that. And then in the midst of it, still full of vigor and vim, for whatever reason or for no reason at all, Moses was called to a faithful death. The text doesn't say that God ended Moses' life, but the authors go to great pains to show us the intimacy with which God accompanied Moses and cared for Moses in his death. And that is the good news in the midst of this baffling, all too familiar story. Moses' ending, the great prophet, Moses' ending prompts us to think differently about what God promises us when God calls us to life, to think differently about our place in the story. Moses' ending demands that we rethink our own narratives, Disney endings and American myths, those saccharine hopes that teach us to anticipate a limitless life and a neatly resolved happily ever after. Faithful though he was, Moses was never promised that God would give him the land. Good though he was not promised that God would fulfill his every wish. Diligent though he was never promised that hard work would bring him salvation. He was promised that God would lead and that God would be with him in life and death. God promised God's presence, and that presence is the controlling narrative that makes meaning of Moses' life. That is the good news for all of us. Life can be cut short. Death is often unfair. We know those endings. They are not a sign of God's displeasure or of our own folly. We are not being punished. They are not a call back to become angels in some greater home. They are simply endings. Chaos in the middle, searing and grief-filled. But in all of them, through all of them, with the community and the aggrieved, God is present, and that is the promise. I think about that moment on the airplane all the time. The horror that I felt when the dangling threads of this weird TV show flashed in front of my eyes. And in my more generous moments, I realized that it may never have been about Game of Thrones. It was some greater grief. Grief at the universality of endings. I was afraid when I realized that I had no control over a story that I thought I had been writing. I was afraid that life would simply go on, that I would never know who sat on the throne, that I would never find a job that I loved, that I would never marry, never return to those boisterous Sunday roundtables, afraid that I would miss that funeral and that all of my work would come to nothing. I had assumed that I was in control of my carefully curated life, and that if I was good enough, everything would work out in the end. I forgot that I was following after a story already in progress. That the chaos of life does impede our best laid plans, that we are not promised Disney endings, and that each of us is limited and rarely in control. And if that sounds too dire, too much like the Brothers Grimm, let me hasten to add this. I forgot that the God who claimed me in baptism, like it or not, and called me to a life of discipleship is from the very beginning a God who bends chaos into order, creating beauty out of the ashes of our lives. I forgot that I was following and God was creating. I forgot that God was with me and that God, even in endings, was calling me on. That is the promise. It is mine and yours. It is Moses's and Abraham's and my grandmother's. God, who is unfolding the story of the kingdom on earth, still has work to do, and we are called We are called to our role in that work, to the yes of laboring in the vineyard. We are called to follow along the surprising, beautiful, difficult, circuitous way until our part in the story ends. And when it does, we can trust this promise. Though it ends with God. Our work may come to its close, but God labors on. So we can mourn our endings like Moses. We can grieve and argue at the fate we inherit. Like the Israelites, we can grieve with those whose lives are cut short in the middle. It is a faithful argument and God can bear it, but it is not the end of the story. Our endings do not erase the good work of faith that has come before. Moses did not enter the land, but he led the way. And the Israelites finally got there. But that wasn't the end of the story. Empires rose and empires fell. God stayed faithful while the people strayed. God commissioned prophets to remind them of the covenant. And then, just when the time was right, God became flesh and proclaimed the goodness of a kingdom that is always bent toward freedom. God healed and taught and was crucified and dead and buried. But even that dark tomb, even that cursed tree was not the end of the story. God continued the story that began in the garden and moved through a promise and a prophet by the power of the Spirit. That very same God is writing the story still. By the power of the Spirit, we get to say yes to that story, to be a part of that story. God is still working among us, and God is still calling. In and through all of our vulnerabilities, through our joys and our scars and our hopes and our fears, we are called to take the world into our arms and then to release it. God promises to be with us, to keep us in life and in death, and even after death, to raise us, scars and all, to a new community, a life everlasting. God calls us to beginnings, to our part in the work. And then our story ends, at least on this side, with God, in God, through God. That is our calling, all of us, right smack in the middle. Thanks be to God.